She put her fork down in the middle of the meal, and that was when I knew. Not because the food was bad. I'd made the same turkey stuffings I'd been making for 20 years, the one with sage and dried cranberries that my daughter had asked for every Christmas Eve since she was 9 years old. She loved it. She always went back for seconds. That Christmas Eve, she barely touched her plate. I watched her from across the table. Her name is Abby. She's 28 now, which still catches me off guard sometimes. In my head, she's still the kid who used to fall asleep in the car before we even made it out of the Tim Hortons drive-thru on Sunday mornings. But there she was, sitting at my dining room table, with her shoulders pulled up slightly toward her ears, laughing at something the man beside her had just said, and not once looking at me. The man's name was Damon. She'd met him 4 months earlier in September at some kind of networking event downtown. She'd mentioned him first in passing. "I met this interesting guy, Dad. He does something in international finance." And then more and more, until by November every story she told seemed to have him somewhere in it. I'd been looking forward to meeting him. I'd told myself not to be the overprotective father. I'd reminded myself she was an adult. I'd bought a decent bottle of wine for dinner. He arrived 40 minutes late. He didn't apologize. He walked in, shaking snow off his jacket, complimented the house in the way people compliment houses when they're calculating what they're worth, and sat down at the table before I had a chance to offer him the seat. He was polished, very polished. The kind of polish that takes effort, hair just so. Watch that caught the light when he moved his hand, a way of speaking that always seemed to land one level above wherever the conversation was. He called me sir twice and then switched to calling me by my first name without being asked. "My name is Glenn, 61 years old, retired from 26 years at the Municipal Works Department in Barrie, Ontario. I'm not a complicated man. I like hockey, I make my own bread, I go fishing with my neighbor most weekends when the weather allows. I don't have a lot of money, a decent pension, a paid-off house, some RRSPs I've been careful not to touch. I'm not wealthy. But Abby's mother and I raised her right, and that's always felt like more than enough. Her mother passed 6 years ago. Abby and I have been each other's closest family ever since. That's the part that matters for this story." Damon talked through most of the dinner, not in an aggressive way, more like a man who's used to being listened to and has never really had to stop and wonder whether that's earned. He talked about a deal he'd been part of in Singapore. He talked about a colleague in Vancouver who'd made his first million at 32. He talked about the Canadian real estate market in a tone that managed to sound both authoritative and slightly pitying, the way someone talks about a problem they're glad they've already solved. I asked him what, specifically, he did. He said he worked with a portfolio management group called Clearstone Equity Solutions. Private clients, high net worth individuals, alternative investments. He said it with the ease of someone who'd answered that question 100 times and had learned which words made people's eyes light up and which ones made them ask follow-up questions. I asked a follow-up question. I said, "What kind of alternative investments?" He smiled and said, "The kind that aren't available through your bank." And then he looked at Abby in a way that I can only describe as conspiratorial, like they'd already talked about me, like this was a conversation he'd been expecting to have. I picked up my fork and kept eating. But I was watching Abby, and that was when I noticed it. She'd arranged her cutlery wrong. I know that sounds like nothing. But here's the thing. Abby and I have a system. We've had it since she was a teenager, since the years right after her mother got sick the first time, and we were both walking around carrying more fear than we knew what to do with. We were at a restaurant one night, the two of us, waiting for test results we didn't have yet, trying to have a normal dinner, and she'd been on a date the week before that had gone badly. She hadn't told me how badly until that night. She'd been trapped, she said. Didn't feel safe, saying no out loud. Didn't want to make a scene. Wished there'd been a way to signal me without the other person knowing. We invented one. If she ever needed me to intervene, to make an excuse to leave, to just know that something was wrong without her having to say so in front of someone, she would place her dinner knife on the left side of her plate instead of the right. That's it. That's all it was. A knife on the wrong side. I'd seen her do it twice in 28 years. Once at a work function where her boss had been making her uncomfortable. Once at a family gathering where a cousin had said something that upset her. Both times I'd found a reason to pull her aside within minutes. That Christmas Eve, in the middle of dinner, while Damon was telling a story about a client in Calgary who doubled his portfolio in 14 months, my daughter quietly moved her dinner knife to the left side of her plate. She didn't look at me when she did it. She kept her eyes on Damon and kept the polite, slightly dazzled expression on her face that she'd been wearing since he arrived. but the knife was on the left. I set my own fork down and said I'd forgotten the cranberry sauce in the kitchen. I got up. I went to the kitchen. I stood at the counter for a moment, staring at a jar of ocean spray that had been sitting there all evening and did not need to be retrieved because it was already on the table. 30 seconds later, Abby came through the kitchen door. She didn't say anything right away. She went to the sink, turned on the tap, ran water over her hands. I waited. She had a way of doing that when she was collecting herself. The water, the few seconds of quiet that she'd had since she was a kid. Then she turned off the tap and said, "I need you to listen to me and not react, okay?" I said, "Okay." She told me she'd been putting money into something called Clearstone Equity Solutions for the past 6 weeks. She said Damon had explained it to her in early November. Private equity fund, consistent returns, minimum investment of $5,000. She'd put in 5. Then, 3 weeks later, she'd felt confident and put in another 8. She'd moved it from her TFSA. She said the online portal looked professional, showed her real-time balance updates, showed projected returns of 12 to 15% annually. She said, 2 days ago, she'd told him she might want to withdraw some of it for a trip she was planning with a friend in the spring. He'd said that was fine. He'd just need her to cover a short-term administrative fee first. 3% of her total balance, before the withdrawal could be processed. To release the funds. It was standard, he'd said. She'd gone quiet for a moment and then said she'd think about it. That was when something had shifted for her. She said, "I looked it up online last night after he left. I couldn't find Clearstone Equity Solutions registered anywhere with the OSC. I searched for an hour." The OSC, the Ontario Securities Commission. She knew to look there because I'd mentioned it years ago, after I'd gotten a cold call about an investment opportunity that hadn't felt right, and I'd checked before I agreed to anything. I was grateful in that moment that I'd said something about it once. I hadn't even remembered saying it. I asked her how much was in there total. She said $13,000. I kept my face still. I said, "Okay." She said, "I think I made a terrible mistake." I said, "You didn't make a mistake. You trusted someone. That's different." I meant it. It's an important distinction, and I want to be clear about it here. There is a category of person who sees financial fraud coming from a mile away and feels smart for spotting it. I have never been that person, and I don't particularly admire that kind of person. Abby is intelligent, careful, and nobody's fool. She'd just met someone who was very, very good at what he did. We had to go back to the table. We couldn't stay in the kitchen for long without it looking strange. I told her, "Say nothing tonight. Be warm but vague. We'll deal with this after." She nodded. She picked up the cranberry sauce. We went back. I watched Damon for the rest of that dinner with a completely different set of eyes. What I saw was this: a man who was excellent at creating intimacy quickly, at making whoever he was speaking to feel intelligent and included and slightly lucky to be in on something. He had a way of dropping amounts of money into conversation in a way that felt casual and therefore credible. Not boastful. Just matter of fact, the way you'd mention the weather. He had a story ready for every skeptical question without seeming defensive about being asked. And he had a particular way of looking at Abby that I think was calculated to look like affection, but was actually, I now understood, management. He was monitoring her comfort level. He was making small adjustments. It was subtle enough that I might not have seen it if I hadn't known what to look for, but once I knew, I couldn't unsee it. After dinner, he helped clear the table without being asked, which I have to admit is a good move. We had coffee in the living room. He talked about what he was planning to do for New Year's and made a comment about taking Abby somewhere for her birthday in February, which was plausible enough to be convincing. He thanked me for dinner in a way that was warm and specific. He mentioned the stuffing, said he hadn't had a home-cooked meal like that in months. It was well done. I almost wanted to believe him. He left around 10:30. Abby and I sat at the kitchen table until almost midnight. We looked up Clearstone Equity Solutions together on my laptop. She was right, not registered with the OSC, not listed with the FEC, no physical address that resolved to anything real. The domain for their website had been registered 11 months ago through a privacy proxy. The phone number listed on the site went to a voicemail box with a generic outgoing message that had no name or company on it. I'd seen enough. We called the non-emergency line for the Ontario Provincial Police that night and filed an initial report. The officer we spoke to was thorough and not unkind. He told us this was a pattern they'd seen before: romance-adjacent financial fraud, longer build-up than typical romance scams, professional presentation, technology that looked sophisticated. He said the administrative fee demand at the point of withdrawal was almost always the moment the victim either paid more money into a black hole or realized something was wrong. Abby had realized something was wrong. She said afterward, "Why did I feel like the stupid one when he first said the fee? I just accepted it. I didn't even question it at first." I said, "Because the whole thing was designed to make you feel like you'd be embarrassing yourself to question it. That's the mechanism, isn't it? It's not about greed, contrary to what people like to assume about fraud victims. It's about shame, the embarrassment of appearing unsophisticated, the discomfort of making a scene." Damon had built a version of reality in which questioning him would make Abby seem small and untrusting, and he'd been building it for 4 months before he ever mentioned a fee. The next morning, Christmas morning, I sat in my kitchen with my coffee and thought about the knife on the left side of the plate. She'd trusted me. After 4 months of being carefully managed and gradually convinced, something had tripped a wire inside her, and instead of confronting Damon directly, instead of doubting herself into silence, she'd reached for the thing we'd built together when she was a teenager, and the world felt uncertain. A small, simple, private signal. I'm not going to pretend I handled this perfectly. I was angry in ways I had to work to keep below the surface that night. I spent Christmas morning fantasizing, uselessly, about saying things to Damon that I was never going to say. I thought about the $13,000 and what it had taken her to save it. She works as an office administrator for a dental practice in Barrie. She is careful with money. She saved. That $13,000 was real money, and it had taken real time, and the thought of it sitting in some fictitious portal controlled by a man who'd eaten my stuffing and complimented my house made me feel a particular kind of quiet rage. But that wasn't the main thing I felt. The main thing I felt, the thing I came back to, past the anger and the worry, was that she'd come to me. She'd been in over her head, and she hadn't been alone in it, and she'd found a way to tell me with nothing but a dinner knife. The police investigation is ongoing as I'm writing this. We've been advised not to contact Damon directly, and we haven't. An officer called me 10 days after Christmas to say they'd identified 2 other individuals in Simcoe County who had been defrauded by someone matching the same description, operating under a similar scheme. They said the investigation had expanded. I don't know what will happen with the money. The officer was honest with us. Recovery in these cases is possible but not guaranteed. We've filed everything we can file. We've documented every interaction Abby could remember. What I can tell you, though, is that she's okay. She cried once, hard, the week after Christmas, and then she got angry, which I considered a good sign, and then she started doing research into investment fraud reporting in Ontario, which I considered an even better sign. She's been talking to someone. She blocked Damon's number on Christmas Day. A few weeks ago, over a Saturday morning breakfast at my kitchen table, she told me she'd been thinking about the knife. She said, "I don't know exactly when I knew something was off. It wasn't one thing. It kind of crept up on me. But when the fee thing happened, I kept thinking, if I could just get through dinner without making it obvious, if I could just get to the kitchen." That was all I was thinking about. I said I hadn't known she'd been feeling that way through the whole meal. She said, "I figured you didn't. That's why I moved the knife. The thing about the signals we build with the people we love is that they only work because of everything that came before them." The knife meant something because of 28 years of something, because of Sunday mornings at Tim Hortons and hospital waiting rooms and dinners where neither of us felt much like eating, but we showed up anyway. Because I'd said something offhand once about the Ontario Securities Commission. Because when she was a teenager and she felt trapped in a restaurant with no way out, her first thought was to find a way to reach me. You build these things slowly, without knowing you're building them. And then one Christmas Eve, across a table, your daughter sets her knife on the wrong side of her plate, and something you never expected to use turns out to be exactly what you needed. I don't know what Damon is doing right now. I think about it sometimes, and then I decide not to think about it. The police are working. That's enough for me to hold on to. I know what Abby is doing. She's okay. She's more than okay. That's the part that matters. If there's anything I want you to take from this, it's not a list of warning signs, though those matter too. It's something simpler. Know what to look for with investment opportunities. Anything promising consistent double-digit returns. Any fee required before you can withdraw your own money. Any company you can't verify through official registries like the OSCC. And if something feels off, trust that feeling before you override it with embarrassment. And if you have people in your life you love and trust, find your own version of the knife. Find a signal. Not because you expect to need it, but because the best time to build that kind of trust is before the night you need it to cross a table.